Hey everyone, thank you for having me here at GrabCON. I'm John, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the topic of gamification in my presentation, Tetrominos, Workflows, and the Global Economy. How gamification is reshaping information security bit by bit. That being said, let's go ahead and dive right in. So first things first, here's a quick background info on who I am. I am a pen tester here for State Farm in the United States. Additionally, I am the content director and community manager for TryHackMe. And last but certainly not least, I am one of the leads for the InfoSec Librarians Guild project. Moving on, let's look at what this talk is going to be about. Here's a quick thesis just to give you an idea of what we're going to be going through over the course of this topic on the whole. Gamification is the evolution of learning at its finest. And this is no different within InfoSec. As we embrace gamification, we can further learning and strengthen our industry on the whole. And that's something that we'll see very heavily as we go throughout these next slides. Moving on, let's talk about what is a game. A game, there are a lot of things come to mind when we're first thinking about what a game is, but it's more of a complex topic when you talk about what a game is at its core. As far as modern examples, the big three that come to mind at first are video games, which you can see over there on the right with the Nintendo Game Boy, board games, and even puzzles. But taking a step back, we can see that a game ultimately is entertainment married with challenge and growth. You can have challenging games that you need to get better at. You need to gain skills and experience by playing the game in order to move further. You can have creative games like Animal Crossing or things like that you increase your skill by playing and by experimenting. But we can see that overall, this idea of challenge and growth are really present. And we'll dive into that further as we go throughout this talk. Let's move on to talking about one of my favorite games personally of all time, Tetris. Now, Tetris is nothing short of fascinating. You'll see a little note there on the bottom of the box art from Russia with fun. Tetris is incredibly historical just because of the influence that this game has had across generations and across the world. So this next bit is more or less straight from Wikipedia. Tetris was created in 1984 by Russian software engineer Alexei Pajitnov. This was when he worked at the Russian Academy of Sciences, I believe. Originally designed for the Electronica 60 computer, that was a replica or kind of a spin-off of a computer that we had here in the West, Tetris became a cultural phenomenon which has transcended generations and even the Iron Curtain. While the history and copyrights of this game are nothing short of incredible, our focus today is on games and gamification overall. So why Tetris? And just a quick meta note on this, I highly recommend looking up. There is a video by the gaming historian on the history of Tetris. It is about an hour long, well worth your time. Tetris is just fascinating, and I recommend diving into it. Now, let's talk about what is Tetris. If you've never played it, Tetris is a game that consists of placing these blocks that fall from the top of the screen to the bottom, and those blocks are called Tetrominos. You can see some there on the right. Those blocks are made up of, or shapes that are made up of 4 individual blocks that create a good variety that you have to use to fill lines on the screen and ultimately gain score. So here you have this idea of a sense of accomplishment, be a score, and yet you have a continuing challenge where the game gets faster and faster as you play more and more. And furthermore, you have the introduction of strategy in that you can get more points for clearing multiple lines at once. In the case of clearing 4 lines, you get a Tetris, and even in some other Tetris games, you get even more bonuses and things like that. That being said, we can see how there's an addictive cycle that's started to kick in with even just a simple game like this. Tetris, one of the most magical points before I move on to my next slide, is that no matter even if you don't speak the language that the game's in, Tetris is very easy to understand. When you pick it up, it's a very simple concept, it's very straightforward, and it's almost like this universal communication between you and the game that makes it just riveting to pick up. Now, taking a step back from Tetris, let's talk about how that ties into gamification by taking a look at what gamification is overall. So for gamification, I'm going to be using the Octalysis framework. This was developed by Yukai Cho. Apologies if I butchered his name. The Octalysis framework is a human-centric gamification design that lays out the core drives for motivation. Leveraging this, we can start to break down where and how gamification works. Now, this framework was originally created by Yukai Cho after I believe he was playing Diablo 2, and his friends stopped playing. They slowly just petered off, and then he realized he was the only one playing the game out of his friend group, and he took a step back and he felt this sort of looming dread. And it was this idea that, he had spent a lot of time on this video game and he was wondering what he had gotten out of it. And he wanted to take a step back even further and start to break down why he was compelled to spend so much time playing Diablo 2 and playing other video games in general, and what exactly the driving factors are behind that. And using that and exploring his own drives, he found the framework of Octalysis, which we'll go ahead and break down here. So, Octalysis is made up of, as you would have guessed, 8 core drives, and we're going to go ahead and break those down one by one. The first drive here is this idea of epic meaning and calling. When you enter the world of a video game, you have this idea that you're doing this for the greater good. In the case of, like end-of-the-world games, you have this idea that you need to defeat the big bad in order to actually, you have this greater purpose in life. A great example of this is the Legend of Zelda series, where you have to defeat Ganon in nearly every game, and it's to stop this sort of apocalyptic enslavement of humanity, or what humanity is left. And it's a very compelling drive overall. The next one that we have, Core Drive 2, is development and accomplishment. I alluded to this earlier with the idea of skill, but you want to have this idea that when you're looking at a game, you can see this progress bar, you can see these accomplishments that you've got. In the example of Xbox, Gamer Score, you have PlayStation trophies, things like that, that make you feel that you've gained something, you've grown, and that your progress is measured. A good example of this is the world map in Mario, where you have these individual levels that you have to clear, and it shows on the world map afterwards that you've cleared everything until you just have Bowser's Castle left there. Moving on, we have core drives 3 and 4. Number 3 is the empowerment of creativity and feedback. Animal Crossing is an excellent idea for both of these core drives. And let's go ahead and talk about core drive 4 before I talk about the game overall. Core drive 4 is this idea of ownership and possession. And these core drives really go hand in hand because when you're putting in this effort, you want to have ownership to be able to show that your creative prowess is growing. Or maybe you're taking a step back looking at like fighting games or brawlers. You come up with a creative solution to beat a boss, or maybe a new combo that, it works really well against how your opponent's fighting style. But in the Animal Crossing games, you have this idea of your island, specifically in the newest one, New Horizons, where you have this huge creative canvas, and on that space, you have this idea of ownership, but you can do with it whatever you want. You can show it off, and there's this huge sharing community factor. And those both drives are incredibly compelling. If you have any doubts on this, I recommend looking at the Animal Crossing community. There are some incredibly creative people out there, and it shows just how powerful those drives are. Moving on, we have core drives 5 and 6. So number 5 is social influence and relatedness. This has been a core drive that has really grown, especially with the idea of online multiplayer and tournaments, where you have this idea that if you are the best in the world, for example, at Call of Duty, you are the best in the world. You've won a tournament. Counter-Strike has a very big community around this, and you have this community of people that you can talk to and be able to relate to them. And then Core Drive 6, scarcity and impatience. That's something that goes more or less hand in hand with this one as well, but has some different ideas mixed in. Scarcity, only one person can be the best. Impatience, you have time trials and you have tournaments. You have a round timer in a lot of games. You can see how these things start adding up, and we'll get into the last 2 core drives in a moment, but these start adding up to really push you towards whatever goal the developer of either a game or whatever situation wants to push you towards. Moving on to core drives 7 and 8, we have the idea of unpredictability and curiosity. If you've ever read a book and you just get to the point where you just need to keep continuing on, you need to know what happens on the next page, this is that drive. The idea of exploration and wondering what is going to come next. And you have this idea over on the side where, for example, with the Nathan Drake games or other games like Tomb Raider, that this exploration really is the main core drive. And we'll talk about how these drives mix and how we can have sort of different levels coming up here in a couple slides. But the last drive that we have here, and this gets into what is referred to as sort of black hat, not to be confused with black hat hacking, but black hat game design, where you have this idea of loss and avoidance. This is a core drive that really comes into focus with the Dark Souls or Souls-like games, where dying in those games, it sucks. It's a huge consequence, and you can see immediately the consequences of your actions at play. That's sort of a negative impetus, but you can see how that can drive you. Moving on, we can start to see, and apologize for the low resolution image here, you can start to see how we can measure these different core drives, and we can see how a different situation might have more of one than another, and sometimes might just not have very much of one in general. But you can see this broken down into the 8 core drives per each situation, and in this case being building up a plot. You can see how those core drives can evolve throughout the actual game, and how we can start measuring them and putting them into practice. That being said, let's move into InfoSec. I mean, we're hackers here. Let's talk about how this actually matters beyond just, hacking our brains. So, taking a step back to TryHackMe. This is just a quick history lesson to walk into how we got to gamification with TryHackMe. This was founded in 2018 by Ben, he goes by Skitty, and then Ashu. I joined just a couple months in. I ended up getting involved with, I had created a box that eventually became known as Blue. I had created it for a cyber defense competition, or rather a cyber defense club that I was running at the time, because I wanted a good exercise that had some of these ideas of gamification in it. And eventually just ended up getting involved and joined on with the team. From this, with starting things off, and this is something that Ben and Ashu really focused on, was this idea of the state of learning in InfoSec. Now, anyone who's tried to do some learning in InfoSec will be able to comment on this pretty thoroughly, that it can come across as fragmented, especially because it's a relatively new field in the grand scheme of things. And with fragmentation comes this idea of it potentially being inaccessible. That's a problem. That is a big problem. And ultimately, especially as you move into more higher difficulty levels within InfoSec, you can see that this is difficult on a good day. Things don't always make sense, and there's a lot of room for improvement, and that's something that TryHackMe ultimately was founded on. And one of my favorite ideas here is the analogy of a ladder. A ladder being the ideas of like the different steps that you have to take to learn something. You can't skip over one topic. It doesn't really work that well, and you can't skip rungs on a ladder. From that, you start building up this idea of a learning path and start trying to work your way backwards from maybe you learned something, but you have to learn how you learned it. And that's really where we start seeing a lot of the motivation behind TryHackMe. Moving into this idea of redefining InfoSec education. We wanted to take a look at where was change actually possible. And from this, we found 3 core ideas. First and foremost, we had this idea of addressing the beginner. Then we had don't try harder, try again. That is actually a quote from John Hammond that I just love. And then the idea of security as a game of exposure. Let's break down these ideas. First, we have the concept of addressing the beginner. We wanted to start from fresh with learning, trying to take a step back and trying to figure out where there was a lot of room for growth. Where were those missing rungs? And ultimately, we needed to take a look at what we were learning, what we knew from InfoSec, and tried to consider what had to come before that. So maybe to use Nmap properly, you needed to know networking, you needed to know IP addressing, at least a little bit. And we had to have this idea of where do you first start your journey, because everyone wants to start, but sometimes finding that place to start is the hardest part. Moving on to the idea of don't try harder, try again, we wanted to examine this idea of punishment and reward. With this, we had a really big idea of the removal of punishment with the focus on learning and improvement, because if you're learning InfoSec, it's probably because it's out of passion, because it is a difficult field, not just to get in, but it can be very difficult to learn at times because InfoSec requires this idea of being at sort of a base level where you understand the technology, but then moving into this idea of sort of a mastery where you can abuse it. Because in order to actually hack something, you need to really understand what system is there in the first place so you can understand its flaws. Then we have this idea of punish in private, or just, not at all and then reward in public. The entire idea of, frustration with this learning and punishing people for things that they didn't necessarily know is archaic at best. And, there are situations where it works, but the marrying that with the idea of gamification, there's really just so much more that you can do with that. And then reward in public, that is something we'll go into in a later slide, but having this gamification system really lends itself very well to that reward system. And then security as a game of exposure. When I was first starting, there was this huge stigmata towards looking at write-ups. Everyone thinks that, I'm going to be cheating if I go look at a write-up. And we wanted to really reinforce, and this is something that you can see present in the TryHackMe Discord, it is okay to look at a write-up because you really, if you don't know something, it's very difficult to know what you don't know if you've never heard of it before. And that's really where this concept of exposure comes in. Security, you need to know a lot of different things to sort of a small level, where you have these juxtaposed ideas of breadth and depth. So breadth being how much you have to know, depth being how much of each topic do you need to know. And examining the proper proportions behind that really is how you start defining where the learning has to happen. So say, for example, again, returning that idea of Nmap, knowing a little bit of networking, knowing a little bit about how to get that tool installed, knowing how to use Kali to some extent, or whatever operating system you install it on, but knowing how much of those that you need to know, so how much experience you need to have with Kali, that is where you can start seeing the challenge on the educational level, and really where there was a lot of room for improvement. And you can see as we go throughout these, where these gamification values really are starting to bleed in to InfoSec. And even moving into more specifically, let's break down how gamification works on TryHackMe, or at least some of the major points. So here we have this idea of gamification, first and foremost, in the interface. When you are hacking, it should feel like a game. You shouldn't be punished for not knowing something. You should be rewarded, and it should feel like fun. That's the real power behind gamification, is where you take something that is work and make it fun because it has a gamification factor to it. And you can see this happening with, for example, bug bounty systems where you can get a standing from it, or even more so, a lot of workplaces are slowly adopting this as a reward system. And then we have this idea of points more than anything. We wanted to introduce these points, but there's a mix of, where do points become pointless? Where is that value? And that's really where you start seeing this leaderboard come into play. Additionally, we had this idea of streaks. I believe that's something that Ben came up with, and it's just wonderful. It gives that impetus to keep coming back day after day, because having a big streak gets you rewards. And then you create this idea of a passive but powerful addiction throughout the entire site, where these factors start adding up very slowly, but they add up to be something really compelling and powerful. And then gamification in the challenges. So you can have themed rooms, and this gets into one of my favorite rooms on the website. First and foremost, when I'm going through and taking a look at the box queue, looking at rooms that we're looking to accept, I love this idea of being able to tell a story with whatever box I'm doing. So say, for example, the biohazard room, and I apologize if you've not done this room, I'm going to try to avoid spoilers, but Biohazard is based off of Resident Evil Biohazard. I'm not really big on horror games, but I love that room. Resident Evil is known very well for its challenges, the little puzzles in the game. They're just very well done. And Descal, one of the community members that I don't know if he's still active anymore, I don't believe so, but he took that and translated it into an information security challenge with a slight Resident Evil twist on it. And it makes ultimately a really compelling journey that, some of the challenges are trivial, but you have these extra factors on top of solving InfoSec challenges into how these challenges fit together for what you're ultimately doing in the room. And it's really compelling. If you haven't done this room, before now, I highly recommend doing it even just after this talk, or just go load it up right now. It's a ton of fun. And that's really where you start seeing that gamification factor come into full force, because make no mistake, you're doing work going through that room. You're learning how to do these things. Some of them are not very difficult, some of them are. And that's still work that you're getting people to do on their own time because it's fun. And that's the magic of gamification. And then we have this idea of real world versus the game, especially on the site where, this is, you're learning skills to be able to take them out into the real world. You have to have this balance between gamified and also realistic. And that's something that has to be balanced. And that's something that there's a lot of power in striking that balance correctly. Moving on, we have this idea of rewarding the user. So on top of having gamification in the interface and telling a story with, these boxes or vulnerable virtual machines, we have this idea of rewarding the user with things like Easter eggs. Now, if you haven't done it, there was day 24 for 2021's Advent of Cyber 2020, the most recent one as the time of this recording. Day 24 was a box created by myself, Mirland, Oracle, Spooky, and Varg of the TryHackMe community. And it is just riddled with Easter eggs. If you've done that box and you didn't find Easter eggs, go back and don't follow the instructions. Don't follow my instructions at all. There is so much more if you just don't pay attention to me, don't watch my write-up, or the video that I did for that. Just skip over that, explore things that are not where I tell you to go. And you can see this idea of poking around and exploring. It's sort of like the Zelda design of wandering around and you find secrets just for wandering. We would go through, and a lot of times we'll hide some vouchers, like 1 month premium vouchers in TryHackMe boxes that release, and we just won't tell people because it's a ton of fun. A classic example of this, taking a step back to video games, is GoldenEye. GoldenEye is a classic game for the NES, Nintendo Entertainment System, and it was full of Easter eggs, full of cheat codes, full of things that you could explore, and it rewarded people for trying out new stuff. That's really cool idea. And then taking that and putting it in boxes, we have this idea of rewarding exploration and embracing advanced concepts, in that some of the boxes that I design and that we want to look for on the site will have ways that you can just skip by stuff. You can skip steps if you know to do things or know how to do other things that make the boxes easier. There are a lot of ideas like that, and that's really cool. And that's something that, especially if you did a box differently than someone else, that's a fun conversation to have. That's exciting. And then we have probably the most important part of this, the community element. And these are a little bit older screenshots at this point in time, but we have this idea of the leaderboard and the TryHackMe community behind everything. So the subreddit, and then the Discord and the forum. You have a group of hackers that you can learn with. Additionally, you have this idea of certificates of completion. So you get these rewards for completing things. And that's very meaningful because you can show that off on places like Twitter and LinkedIn, and that furthers the community aspect. More than anything, when you're learning hacking, having that group of friends that you can sort of egg each other on, that is one of the best ways you can learn, and it's something that's incredibly powerful. If you don't have a group of friends to learn hacking with, I highly recommend introduce yourself to other people, start making friends, try to figure out who you can hack with, because you will learn better. You will learn more, you will learn faster, you will have more fun playing with other people. And then taking a step forward, let's take a look at how this is going to go in the future. This is something this talk was previously designed for another conference as a keynote. This is something that was a little bit more focused on that, but I wanted to still talk about where the industry ultimately is going to go with this. So labs and levels, this is something we've really focused on at TryHackMe, and I know other sites have focused on this as well. But furthering networks, furthering this idea of multiple machines, and then sort of revisiting that exploration drive, this idea of freedom of choice, or you have a guided experience. There's a lot of progress that can be made there, and I think that that's really where the industry has a lot of room for growth. And then teaching more with less. So more tools available to the user, again, having that idea that if you have a virtual machine that people are in and they've already hacked in, even if they do something that doesn't necessarily matter, and I'll talk about this a little bit with Blue, you still have that space that you can teach, and I think that's something that we can grow a lot on the industry with. Taking a step back and using the example of Blue on TryHackMe, I had this idea when I created it that, hey, we've gain access to this machine, and while it's not necessary to privest because Eternal Blue gets you root on the system, going through and showing how you can use just like privest mechanisms within Metasploit, that's something that you have that space that you can teach with, and you can get a lot of value since you're already there. So it's an idea that I think that we can go a lot further with the industry. And then we have this idea of everyone is a hacker. I think that further, more and more, this is something we've done an excellent job of, but we still have a ways to go, is being more accepting with our industry. And gamification is for everyone. And taking that and driving home the point of anyone can learn this, agnostic of, age, gender, if you have disabilities, I think that there's a lot that we can do with that. And then being human in everything. This is something that I think that the community overall has a lot of ways we could grow, and this is something that you could take a step back and get on a soapbox with. But there's a human behind that keyboard, at least until the robots take over, and really focusing on that, not just in the community aspect, but focusing on it from our educational aspect. We learn distinctly as humans. We have a lot of progress with that, and that's somewhere that I see the industry growing immensely. And again, the future of InfoSec training, I already talked about this quite a bit, but increased coverage for like Blue Team, and this is something that we've had a lot of additions for, and keep posted for a potential event with this on TryHackMe. You didn't hear from me. Further training of Red Team. So again, these exams such as DFIR, advanced topics, DFIR being digital forensics and incident response. I think these advanced topics are really where we're going to see a lot of growth. And then redevelop trainings, putting feedback to good use. This is one of our favorite things to do on TryHackMe is, maybe a part of the room is just completely, it's very confusing. And it's not necessarily confusing to us, but that's a sign that maybe we need to go back and rewrite that, and maybe there needs to be a hint. So something that we can do a lot as industry. And then redefine learning experience. I'm going to glaze over this pretty quickly, but exploration of how we learn further than just the basic understanding. There is a Veritasium video that's not super old on this that I recommend checking out, just because that entire idea of the different types of learning is very flawed, and it's something that we need to move past on an educational level. And then the expansion of modalities for our actual teaching. So further leaning into gamification, leaning into more experimental learning methods, and then really pushing this idea of asynchronous training, like with sites such as TryHackMe or other online training sites, pushing that further so that we can go further as an industry on the whole. Just some concluding thoughts to wrap this up. Again, gamification is the evolution of learning at its finest, and this is no different within InfoSec. As we embrace gamification, we can further learning and strengthen our industry on the whole. And hopefully throughout the presentation, that has been something that has been clear as we explore just how much growth is possible. That being said, thank you for having me here at GrabCON. I am John. I go by Darkstar Online. Feel free to follow me on Twitter, but otherwise, thank you so much and have a great rest of your conference.